So good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Rosenthal. I'm a park naturalist at Gulf Branch Nature Center. I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to join me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get started. Screen. No. And there. And um, so we're going to talk about catalpa trees, and it's not just catalpa trees because this is really a drama with three main players. And I want to talk a little bit about that and the complex things that are going on right above your head. And I think that when I started doing these a few years ago, these are the kind of things I like to see. I like to know everything. I can be a nosy busybody, and it gets me in trouble. But I think for this job, it can be a really good thing, a lot of fun thing. And I've noticed something happening on the catalpa tree next to our pond for several years, and so I wanted to get to know more about it and learn more about it, and it's really opened up a whole different world. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and I'll intersperse some of these things in there as I talk about it. We're going to start by meeting our first player, which is the catalpa tree. This is the northern catalpa. This is Catalpa speciosa, and this is a tree or a couple trees. Not entirely sure if it's one or many that was I photographed over at Gravelly Point. I'm not entirely sure where, but I do know where. If you park at Gravelly Point, start to go down the bike path that leads towards Washington, D.C. If I can get somebody to mute their mic, that would be fantastic. Oh, you did. Thank you. If you go towards that bike path that goes around along the river and around um, the athletic field, there's a nice little patch back there of a few trees. Sometimes you get some interesting birds in there, and that's where I photographed this catalpa. Like I said, we also have one right next to our pond. This was just one that isn't all surrounded on all sides by trees, but you can see it's got a really beautiful flower when that's in bloom. I think it happens in May, so I think we're already past kind of that blooming time here. But as I mentioned, obviously this is a medium-sized tree, and it's in the genus Catalpa, and it's a species is speciosa. There's only two species in North America. There's these really beautiful flowers. They're in something called panicles. There's a big arrangement of them. They're pretty wide and they can get pretty large. You get the white flower. You get nice orange coloration and some specks of purple in there. Usually find some interesting critters in here. I think this, if I remember correctly, this is a yellow beetworm moth that was hanging out, which is part of the reason I took this picture. But this is catalpa that's actually growing on the corner of the property I'm living on right now, which is really neat. Um, Again, as I mentioned, they are a medium-sized tree. They get to about 40, 60 feet tall, 20 to 40 feet in diameter. Whoops, a little extra two there. But they can grow really fast. You can get 20 feet of growth in a 10-year sapling if they're doing really well. It's really impressive. And then they have siliques, which are 8 to 20 inches long. And these are big, long seed pods, look like these giant green beans growing on this side of the tree or growing on the tree. And that's what they have all their seeds in. And it's pretty distinctive. Um, as I mentioned, they get the pretty flowers. So this is the northern catalpa again, the speciosa. There are two species that you'll find here in North America. Northern catalpa is on the left, southern catalpa is on the right. This is what is thought to be their natural distribution. Oh, come on, hit the pad the wrong way. Apologies, folks. So you can see it's a really small patch here along the Mississippi River from Arkansas, a little bit of Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana, and a couple patches up here. On the right is the southern catalpa across Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida. Excuse me. Now, this is what's thought to be their distribution, their natural distribution. They have since found discovered evidence in the Ohio River on the West Virginia side of a settlement that dates back to 1500 to 1700, and there's evidence of catalpa in there. So whether there was catalpa trees there prior to colonization, whether that's part of a natural distribution or whether I was already moving some. Not entirely sure. My guess and what the prevailing thought on that is that that's part of that might mean that their previous natural range is larger than we thought. but generally these two images here are what's thought to be the range for the two species. Now, if you go on iNaturalist and you look at all these red spots represent sightings across the U.S. You see them up into Maine, down into Florida, all the way across here. They stop kind of at the Great Plains here, but you'll also see it scattered throughout here. That is a far cry from those two tiny little natural ranges I showed you, and it shows you how popular the catalpa tree is as an ornamental tree and for other uses, that it's been introduced in so many different places. You can see it's even up in a little bit in some spots into Canada here and in southern Ontario. Okay. It's used as an ornamental tree, as I mentioned. It's adapted to a moist, high pH soil and full sun, but it'll grow just about anywhere. It's a pretty successful tree. Our tree that we have next to the pond, it's I don't know about the pH. I can tell you it's definitely moist because obviously it's right next to the soil. It does get a fair amount of sun because there's an opening there from the pond. And it seems to be doing pretty well, except for something I'll explain to you in a minute here. They have a soft wood that's like white pine. It can be really pretty. You can see it's used for furniture, interior trim, cabinetry. They highlight the wood's fine grain. It's a really good looking wood. It has been used for fencing. I underline that because that's important. And it's also been planted literally as a bait tree for something that eats the tree, not the tree itself. But it's planted across the tree, and I'll touch on those last two uses with the introduction of our second player. But I want to come back to the part where it's a soft wood. I read that it also had been used for railroad ties, which I think is fascinating. It didn't sound like that was a very successful use of the wood at all. Um, so our next player is the Catalpa sphinx moth, and if you really focus in on that name, it obviously sounds like there is a relationship between this moth and that tree that's really, really important. And the Catalpa trees are the only known food for the caterpillars of this moth. So that makes those trees very distinctive. Just realized what I should have done was also done a search for these moths and see if that map on iNaturalist mirrors it, because obviously their original range is going to be no different from what we saw in the two catalpa tree range maps, because the moth's only food are the leaves of that tree, specifically the caterpillar. Um, so this is one of the sphinx moths. You can see animal kingdom arthropods, and it's an insect. It's a lepidoptera. It's in the butterflies and moths group, or moths and butterflies, I should say. Sphingidae means it's one of the sphinx moths. A lot of these are day flyers, and then its genus is Ceratomia, and it's a Ceratomia catalpa. So even in its scientific name or Latin name, it's still referencing the catalpa tree. As I mentioned, the Sphingidae are the sphinx moths, and there's a lot of them that are daytime flyers, like this clearwing. This is one of the clearwing moths here. These are the ones that kind of look, you might mistake them almost for small hummingbirds, unless you take a really close look. They hover in and out of flowers, similar to how hummingbirds go about their feeding and pollinating. So that's the group we're in. Now, just like butterflies with their four stages, or with their four phases of development: egg, larva, pupa, and adult, which is called holometabolism, or the old term for that was complete metamorphosis. Moths go through the same thing. They're in the same group. They all have that same development. The sphinx moths, whoops, come on, lay a big cluster of eggs. The eggs hatch into the caterpillars. The caterpillars are very gregarious. They don't seem to have any problem sharing the space. When you're a caterpillar that only eats one kind of tree, it's probably smart not to be very picky, or is it advantageous, I think is the way I should say that, to not be picky and to tolerate other members of your species, your brood, as far as a food source. These are small ones. Again, this is roughly the same kind of leaf and similar in size. You can see the difference between the line there, the vein there versus here, and the size of the caterpillar next to it. These are very small, early instar caterpillars, excuse me, and this is a much larger one. I feel like as they get older, they tend to have a more standard colorations, black on the back and yellow on the side. But don't quote me on that. You can see this younger one is pretty much the same coloration here, but there's a variation in these other two where they've got a lot. This one's got a lot of white and black, and there are some different color variations among the caterpillars that you'll notice. They also have this horny projection here at the end, which is not a stinger and can literally do nothing to you. Yeah, you can see it in the one on the right there. It's actually a soft and fleshy protuberance, so it's not something that's going to sting or have any effect on the handler. Um, they have a very uncocoon-like pupa. It looks a lot more like a chrysalis. And this pupates under the soil before it develops into the adult. Here's an adult that's freshly emerged on our catalpa tree. And you can see the wings have yet to completely unfurl and shape out. I personally think they are a really pretty moth. They're not strikingly colorful, but they have some really beautiful patterns in their attempt at being camouflaged or cryptically colored. But it's a really, really good looking moth. So this is that life cycle, again, all on one screen. And I had a note here. I want to make sure I'm using it as I'm talking to you to make sure I get this information correct here. Uh, Whoops. There we go. So the winter is passed in the pupal stage. So here, bottom right, this is the pupa. This is how they overwinter until the spring. The males emerge, or the males, excuse me, the adults emerge once the catalpa leaves have appeared. The moths emerge and they lay their eggs. They lay them in these large clumps. The caterpillars arise from them and can feed gregariously, so that it's not like they're all trying to disperse. It'd be very difficult for them in our park because we literally have that one tree, and they have a very very ravenous appetite. They do eat and they do eat quickly. Our tree, I feel like, has been defoliated just about every year that I've been here. Certainly in the last couple of years, they have really done a number, to the point where this year I've been looking for the caterpillars, thinking I would have seen a few by now, and I have not seen any, and I don't know if they really, um, hurt themselves, and it'll take a little time to get back to, uh, previous numbers, or to have a new one find that tree, because last year they defoliated it so bad. This is what the tree looked like. You see, it's a few starting to come back here, but this was July 22nd, I think, and the tree was almost completely devoid of leaves. Catalpa will bounce back. They will readily grow leaves in response to, being completely cleared of the leaves by caterpillars. But to have to do that 2 or 3 times in a season over several years will kill a tree. So it's far from optimal. They can bounce back from it, but if it's a constant pressure from the caterpillars, it will eventually kill the tree. So this happened here again. You can see it leafed out by the end of the summer. It was a fully leaved out tree again. I'm going to go back here for a second. Now, if the caterpillars do get their fill, they leave the tree, end up on the ground. They pupate into the soil. They come out as an adult. You'll have a so the notes that I took this from, and I was really reading this life history. It's a really old book about pests in Ohio, and they talk about having essentially two broods. They have that the moths that come out from their pupa in the late spring, early summer, lay eggs. Those caterpillars feed on the trees, pupate into go down in the soil, pupate, come out as adults, lay a bunch of eggs. Those caterpillars do the same thing, do a whole bunch of eating, pupate into the soil, and then that is the generation, I think, that overwinters. So it's like 2 generations every year. Down here, we might have 3 or 4. Further south, you might even hit 5. 4 or 5 in a season. So they can do that. It depends again on the food source. They've got to have the catalpa trees around in order to feed on them. Interesting side note: these trees were used for fencing. They were really, really important, to the point where they were um, farmed specifically for fencing. The ornamental use obviously was a big deal as well. The trees were put around, are taken around and planted in many different areas, and used as ornamental. And certainly that can, having these caterpillars on it, can take away from that as well. Um, in Troy, Ohio, on August 3rd, 1921, the first crop duster airplane was outfitted. Um, with the ability to spray um, arsenic. What was it? Arsenic, lead arsenic. Getting it wrong here. It's on the next lead arsenate. There we go. Lead arsenate. And what they do is they outfitted this. I think this is a biplane. I don't know my planes very well, but they essentially outfitted this biplane to drop dust that contained lead arsenate across an orchard full of uh, catalpa trees because they were having a really bad outbreak of these sphinx moth caterpillars. And again, this was obviously a commercial application. So these two gentlemen, Dormoy and McCready, flew what is essentially the first heavier than air application of a pesticide on insects. To that point, you just sprayed everything. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to mention some of the things they were using, and it's probably will really have you take a step back and think about the fact that A, the things they were spraying, and then B, were they really using the appropriate um, protective clothing back then to be spraying essentially, with a hand sprayer or with a pump and a hose. So this was a little bit safer, at least for the people, as long as you weren't, under all that. But I think if I say lead arsenate to most of you will be thinking, oh, that's not good stuff. Lead arsenate was probably chosen at the time because, whoops, it was being used pretty regularly for things like gypsy moths, which is this moth on the right here. So lead hydrogen arsenate, and that's what they were using. It is, um, or I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I also want to make a comment about the gypsy moths. Just something I learned recently from going to Shenandoah National Park. They're no longer calling this the gypsy moth, which my guess is this is probably an attempt at being a little more polite with the words. It is now called the spongy moth. I got super excited because I found these caterpillars and put them on iNaturalist, and they said spongy moth. I was like, oh, new species, hooray! And I just happened to stumble across while I was working on this the fact that the gypsy moth species has been renamed to the spongy moth, the common name. It's same Latin name, but a new common name. So they were using lead hydrogen arsenate. Again, that probably sounds really horrible. You can find some historical um, stories about how this was used in some orchards and in some areas so heavily that it affected the groundwater, it affected things growing from there. But this was still 10 times less toxic than Paris green, which is, depending on which one you like, copper acetate triarsenite or copper acetoarsenite, which was really, really bad stuff. And it's bad stuff when they say it wasn't just used as a pesticide, it was used as a rodenticide. It was used on plants. And the problem with Paris green is it was really hard to get it off of what you were spraying it on to wash it and clean it up. And it was ending up, being consumed. And it was definitely toxic. It was not recommended to be used on food crops, but it was still. Um, the lead arsenate they used later was easier to wash off the produce that you were using, and so it was thought to be an improvement. Um, yeah, and Paris green, the name actually comes, it has a bluish green to greenish color, depending on how finely it is chopped up. And it was used in Paris to kill sewer rats. And that's how it got this more common name of Paris green, which is the easiest way to look it up if you want to get more information on it. Eventually, lead arsenate gave way to DDT, and I'm sure that brings up some memories in people. I think most of the time when you talk about DDT, people will talk about Silent Spring, the effects it had on birds like osprey and bald eagle, the bio magnification that happened through the food chain as the DDT moved further and further up. I don't know how many of you know. I took a little digression on pesticides when I was working on this. Um, that DDT is actually won the Nobel Prize for Paul Hermann Mueller, who was a Swiss researcher, because he discovered the insecticidal properties of DDT, and it was used to great effect during World War II to help protect people from malaria and yellow fever. So it started out as probably as a wonder drug, and then later on we found the environmental tolls of it. But it was a pretty big deal. I think they started using it in 31, and by the 30s it was readily used around the world. And again, prior to people really having an understanding of what was happening in the environment, unfortunately. But that's my little digression down pesticide laying there. But I just thought it was interesting that, here are these caterpillars I'm seeing every year in our park, and they were essentially the beginning of aerial spraying of pesticides. They were responsible for that first one. So the final player in our little drama is the hornworm parasitoid wasp. This is a tiny wasp, and if you're not sure how tiny it is, all these little cocoons here are on the skin of a caterpillar. That's what this green background is. So this is a really, really tiny, small wasp. This is probably a tenth of the size of your mud daub or paper wasp, which is the wasp you're much more readily used to seeing and flying around in our dwellings. Um, it is obviously an arthropod insect. It's in the Hymenoptera. It's in there with wasps and bees and ants, some of the other yellow jackets, those kinds of critters. It's in the family Braconidae. Braconid wasps are well-known parasitoids. A parasitoid is a parasite that eventually kills its host. They might let it live for a little while, but eventually the end result of the association is typically that the braconid ends up killing its host. And this one is Cotesia congregata. I don't know which Bracana this is. This is one I photographed in the park, but I had it up there to give you an idea of the size. That's my fingertip. So these are really, really tiny little wasps. Uh, and what those wasps do is they get onto these caterpillars, and they cause them a whole lot of trouble. Like I said, they're parasitoids of these Catalpa sphinx moth caterpillars. Uh, each one of these little white structures on the outside of the caterpillar is actually a cocoon. And it's not just the Catalpa sphinx caterpillar moths, uh, Catalpa sphinx moths. It's not just their caterpillars. This is if I remember correctly, this was a pawpaw sphinx. This is one of the tussock moths on the left, and on the right, I think this was a slug moth. It was not one of the was definitely not in the Sphinx moth family. This was actually the first time I ever spotted this. I thought it was the coolest thing. And again, if you look really close here, especially on this left one, I think I have a close up on the next slide. You can see some of them are open, so the wasps have already emerged. Here we go. You can see that the wasps have already emerged from these cocoons. So these tiny little cocoons they spin. Let me come back here and just give a quick timeline, and then we'll come back and talk about it again. These wasps land on the caterpillar, sting it. When they sting it, they insert an egg or several eggs. The eggs live inside the caterpillar. They can do some fundamental changes to the biology in there. They can certainly affect it. That's how they manage to survive. But what essentially they do is they feed on the interior of the caterpillar, and then eventually, when they're large enough and ready to pupate, they emerge back out through the exoskeleton of the caterpillar, and then pupate on its back. And then they're there for maybe a couple days until they develop into wasps and young wasps and can fly away. I always tell people the best horror movies aren't even on HBO. You just got to look in the trees around you at nature. So, the best supporting player, and I talked about the three main players in this little drama. We have the Catalpa tree, we have the Sphinx moth, and we have um, this Braconid wasp, which parasitizes the caterpillars. The unsung best supporting player are these poly-DNA viruses, which are part of what's injected into the caterpillar by the wasp. Okay, so if you look at this magnification of the diagram here, what they're really looking at is this site here where the wasp is parasitizing the caterpillar. And again, most of the time, I don't feel like the caterpillar. Well, actually, this is a different species. For a Braconid wasp, like we're talking about, they are very tiny in relation to the size of these caterpillars that they're parasitizing. But they oviposit into the caterpillar. And in addition to putting in the wasp egg, they're also putting in a lot, almost like a soup of poly-DNA virus. If you were to take this poly-DNA virus out, if you were to wash it, or rather, I guess the better way to say it is if you were to take these wasp eggs, wash that little soup of poly-DNA virus off, and then insert the wasp eggs into the caterpillar, they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't do it. They cannot survive without this poly-DNA virus soup um, that is injected by the wasp when it stings. Okay, hemocytes, by the way, are part of the immune system of the caterpillar. And you can see they are receiving a full dose of this poly-DNA virus. So what's happening here? The wasp attacks the caterpillar. The caterpillar might switch or move or jerk or twitch a little bit. But the attack by the caterpillar is by the wasp is quick. It happens super fast. It injects and it heads out. The eggs in the soupy mix are injected. The soupy mix includes these poly DNA viruses. The viruses invade the host cells immediately. Okay, they force the cells to make proteins that incapacitate the caterpillar's immune system. And this is really important because the cells will begin to attack each other. They'll attach to each other. They'll lyse or blow up. And the caterpillar can recover from this, but by then it's too late. At that point, the larvae of the wasp are able to either mimic proteins or mimic some other internal portion, fragment or component of the caterpillar so that they are ignored by the immune system. Okay. What is was really, really cool about this, or not cool about this, but it's something to think about. If you think about if you're familiar at all with HIV or AIDS, this is what happens in our bodies when you have full on AIDS as a result of the infection by the HIV virus. The difference is the caterpillar eventually recovers from this. Obviously, humans, it's a whole different story with what happens with HIV and AIDS, but this is essentially the same mechanism that's happening here between the poly DNA virus that's been injected and the caterpillar's immune system. This is what enables the uh, eggs of the wasp to survive inside the caterpillar until the caterpillar becomes, or until the immune system has been changed fundamentally enough and the wasp's larvae have developed enough that essentially they don't, the wasp larvae are not noticed or recognized by the immune, uh, excuse me, yeah, by the immune system. Okay, not all of them survive. Sometimes the wasps don't continue to develop. Something else that's happening while it's in here is the poly DNA virus tends to have to influence the caterpillar to no longer molt. So the caterpillars typically go through about 5 molts before they pupate ahead of adulthood. It will inhibit usually 2 or 3 of those molts, so it might not go through another molt. The poly DNA viruses make the caterpillar hungry. They inhibit in addition to inhibiting the molting, they also inhibit the signals that tell the caterpillar, "Hey, time to get off this tree and go pupate." That doesn't happen either. The caterpillar may double in size, depending on how many wasp larvae are inside there, feeding on the interior of the caterpillar. When the wasp larvae are ready to pupate, the caterpillar actually stops eating for about 8 hours. And I forget exactly what the benefit of that is, but it does stop eating prior to the larvae coming out, and I think it's thought that that might prevent the caterpillar from consuming the larvae, even though obviously most caterpillars are not carnivorous. Okay, where does the virus come from? And this is I got a note here in the book, and I want to pull this out. So if I'm not looking directly at you, you know why. The um the DNA for this virus is scattered throughout the genome of the males and the females. They both have the instructions to make these poly DNA viruses. In the males, they stay scattered and they never unite. But in the females, as soon as the female metamorphoses into an adult, the virus awakens. In certain cells or ovary, the pieces of the virus's genome work. Um, or are cut out of the wasp DNA and are put together. So essentially like taking little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and putting it all together to form one big puzzle. And what happens is once this is all formed, the viruses begin to multiply and they begin to load up inside the nucleus of the ovary cell. And when it fills up, the cell bursts, and this specialized cell, the cell bursts, and millions of these viruses float free in the wasp ovary. And that's how these viruses are then available when the wasp stings the prey. And so it's just this really an amazing system. All this is happening in these tiny little organisms that you may never notice unless you actually go looking for them. And they're not alone. The caterpillar is thought to be a zombie, and that term gets used a lot. And personally, I think it's kind of fun because I think it helps with popularizing it. But essentially, the DNA viruses and the larvae of the wasp have kind of hijacked the caterpillar to get it to do what they want. They get the caterpillar to continuously eat, so it's bringing in energy. Instead of the caterpillar storing that energy as fat, which is what they would use later in the pupal stage as the energy to metamorphose into an adult, Um, the caterpillar eating all this leaf stuff, and they convert it right into sugar, which is immediately and readily available as an energy source for the larvae of the wasp. So essentially, they've hijacked that caterpillar. There are other wasps that do this to other organisms. Dinocampus coccinelli is another type of wasp that does something similar to uh, ladybird beetles, like this ladybird beetle here. This is actually one from UK, but you can see what's happened is the um, uh, excuse me, the larva of the wasp have emerged from the ladybug, and the ladybug is actually protecting the pupa of all these wasps until they become adults, because there are a few that stay behind in the ladybug's body and change its functioning so it does that. There's a lot of technical stuff here, and trying to talk about these other different ones is fascinating. There's a wasp that goes out and stings cockroaches, and stings them literally in the head and the brain, and removes their ability to walk, but they can still fly, and then guides them back, or their control of their ability to walk, I think is what it is, and it guides them back to a burrow that they've made, and then they stick an egg on it, and this cockroach, yeah, they remove its ability to walk, and then the cockroach can't move anymore, and this egg hatches, and that larva eats a very fresh cockroach. Um, and that's what happens a lot of times is these critters that are being parasitized are being eaten while alive. Um, Again, nature has the best horror stories. Don't have to make up any crazy stuff. You can just watch, especially with wasps. Um, this is a spotted pink lady beetle. This is another, and this is a North American species. And I just want to show that this is another one that will be affected by Dinocampus coccinelli. And this is one you can find pretty regularly and commonly around here in parks and stuff. And it's a tiny ladybird beetle. That's my one of my fingers there. And this is one of a single flower in that big head of flowers on the common milkweed. So you can see it's not a big critter. And it's, just like other ladybugs. They're looking for small insects and aphids to eat. The interesting thing is about 25% of these spotted pink lady beetles that are infected by these parasitic wasps will actually recover fully. Um, but 1 in 4 is still it's not great odds. And then this is really neat. This is Gellus agilis. This is you can see there's no wings. It's a wingless wasp. But it's still got that stinger at the end of the abdomen, and this is a hyperparasite. This is an organism that will go out and parasitize the eggs of those, or I'm sorry, will parasitize the pupa of those wasps as they're coming out of other insects. So those wasps sound really horrible, but they've also got their own predators as well. They've also got their own critters that will take advantage of them as well. So there are layers of parasitism that you'll see out there, which are just absolutely incredible. Um, Gosh, there was a fact about this I wanted to remember to tell you. Hopefully, I remember it. But there are really neat little critters as well. Um, so that's kind of wrap up. This went a lot quicker than I expected. There was a lot of stuff in there I wanted to talk about. Um, but this is, again, this is one of those things that I've always wanted to kind of bring to the deep dive is simply, um, you know, these are the kinds of things that are happening right around us, and we don't see that very often. Um, but they're happening right above our heads. They're happening all around us. These amazing. I had this all prepared in my head. All these things happen, and it's all these tiny little things. That's to me such a tremendous thing to have. That this insect is not just stinging and parasitizing another insect, but it's injecting these poly-DNA viruses, which essentially affect the interior chemistry and the organs of these other critters. And it's happening on a small scale, but it happens. And it happens all around us with many species, probably some that we don't see on a regular basis, but even researchers have a hard time finding it and observing this. In fact, let me see if I can find it. That old Ohio bulletin I was reading, it was fantastic. They were talking about these caterpillars, which will get eaten by cuckoos, yellow and black-billed, by Baltimore orioles and catbirds. We don't have those a lot in our nature center area, which is another reason that they probably are so prolific on that tree. We do get the yellow-billed cuckoos, but I don't know that they stick around for very long. Um, oh, here it is. But there are parasitic species that prey upon those the parasitic species that prey upon the caterpillars, they had it the old name Apanoles congregatus. They didn't even know it was a wasp at this time. This was written, in the early 20th century. They didn't even know it was wasp. They said it was wasp-like. It was just absolutely amazing to see how much we've learned just recently. So again, tiny little critters and all this going on, and we're just learning about it. So it's worth keeping an eye out there. I hope y'all really enjoyed it. Like I said, it went a little faster. I think this is one of those things I get really excited about and I talk a little fast. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to make an attempt to answer them. Um, yeah. But that's where I'm at. If anybody has any questions, Melanie, go ahead.
Yeah. So I take it that the caterpillar then gets killed, right? And
Yeah,
like
they
gets
don't survive.
parasitized,
They don't survive.
right?
They don't survive.
So
Yep.
is there anything that controls or eats the wasp or you know
Yes.
controls it?
Yeah, I don't know if it controls it, but there was that last one there, Agilis. Let me see if I can pull it up here as we're talking. That last one, the Agilis, that is a parasite of the
The jealous Achilles, yeah.
yeah, that's not I didn't write that name. I'm gonna have to pull it up here as we're talking. Uh oh, jealous Agilis. There we go. If I could spell it right, that would help a lot. Yeah, that just says it attacks. It will attack other species of Cotesia. It will also attack the Dinocampus, which was the one that was affecting the ladybug. In fact, there's a species out there. I didn't get a chance to add this one in. It was hard to find a picture. There's another species of Cotesia, of that Pecan wasp that the caterpillars that they've infected, when the pupae state come out, they uh, change it to not only they affect it to not only stick around and protect the larva, but the caterpillar will actually spin webbing over it. Like they would spin a cocoon, but they spin a cocoon over the larvae of the wasps. And then the caterpillar will curl up and lay on top of it to protect them. Just talk about an insult. But yeah, once they're in there, they affect the caterpillar so that they will not molt again and they will never develop into adulthood.
So then, do you need to spray the trees at all, or no? You just let happen
For which one?
to get rid of the caterpillars or to get rid of the
Yeah, like that
you
to get
know
rid of the caterpillars. I really think you need to, or get a pet cuckoo. You could put a cuckoo up there and would eat them. Cuckoos do really well with like tent worms as well. Um, but yeah, they're and I just don't think we have cuckoos. I'll hear the yellow-billed occasionally in the park in the spring, but they don't stick around. It might be a different story somewhere like I know for a fact I like to go up to Great Falls on the Maryland side, and I feel like throughout most of the summer I can hear or see one there that I think are breeding in that park. But we don't have that here. We don't have Baltimore Orioles. We just don't have the right kind of area for that. We don't have them. You might find them along the river, but I don't know that I've ever seen one in our park. And so I know we have catbirds, but that's about the only one. So yeah, so they'll to get rid of the caterpillars would be that, and then you lose the wasp without that, or they just go find other species. I don't think they're as specific to the caterpillar as the caterpillar is to the leaves.
Mhm.
So
Good. Okay.
sure, sure. Anyone else?
I have a comment.
Okay.
I think when we were kids around Chicago, we called them cigar trees.
Yes. Yeah, I did read that. Oh, thank you for saying that. Was that Tom?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Um, I mentioned they're called bait trees. There were in several places when I was doing the research, I found where people reference the fact that they will plant them they would plant them in the southeast because the caterpillars were considered such good bait that they would literally plant the tree just so they could get the caterpillars off it. So they're often called bait trees or worm trees. And it was literally to not had no interest in the tree or anything it would produce. They just wanted the caterpillars off it for fishing. Since I'm here, one more thing I will say. This is not a new book, but it is a fantastic book. I always like to recommend books. I'm going to pull it back here, put it in front of my face. There we go. Parasite Rex is fantastic, and it will make you think. um, the section I read on how many parasites there are for each species of vertebrate in tropical forests would just make you think twice. I mean, it's not going to stop you from going, but it'll really make you think about where you're walking into. It's crazy, crazy stuff. And it's a fantastic book about all things parasites. If you're into that, I highly recommend it. It's really good stuff. Well, if no one has any other questions, I will say thank you. July, I'm doing biophilic communities, and in August, I'm doing stinging insects. If anybody has something they would like me to do or approach, please let me know. For some reason, I had a hard time coming up with topics in the fall, but
Fungi.
feel free to email me if you have any. Oh, go ahead, Melanie.
Fungi, like, different
Oh,
kinds of fungi.
I could also, maybe I'll even outsource that one because we got two people on staff that are way better at fungi than I am. So maybe I'll see if I can con them into doing one. And then you guys will get a break from my voice for once.
That, and also like common butterflies we see here, in the and their hosts,
Okay.
like the kinds of trees that encourage kinds of butterflies we want to see,
Sure.
like spice bush swallowtail. Like if you
Mhm.
like I have a lot of black swallowtail butterflies that come into my yard, my garden, because I have two big spice bush trees.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if I'm attracting them, like.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Moths are a nice barometer when you have a lot of moths in your area. It's a nice way of understanding that you have a pretty good diversity of plants uh in your
I have a lot
forest
of
or in your
moth.
surroundings. Yeah, because of how many moths you get, and how many different
I have a
species.
lot of moth-eaten woolens too.
Yeah, that'll do. That'll happen. All right. Well, if no one else has any other questions, I will say thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate you all joining me this evening. And I hope you have a good one. And hopefully we'll see you next month.
Thank you so much. It's really good.
Thanks, Ken.
No
Yeah.
problem. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank
Bye-bye.
you, Ken. It's great.
Sure. Bye bye.